Welcome everybody. This is the NBCI CIP Design webinar. I'm Tom Daly with the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative, and Molly Foley is also presenting. She's a spatial data analyst for NBCI, and we're both based out of the University of Tennessee, working for NBCI. Welcome to the webinar. It looks like we're approaching, I don't know, 15, 20 people or more. So we won't be able to go around and introduce ourselves, but I can see from some familiar names, many state agency staff and others that I don't recognize. A couple things to point out that I'll let Molly, why don't you talk a little bit about navigating through Zoom while I try to get the right screen up?
Sure. So first things first, a lot of people are on here and there can be a lot of background noise. So there's a button usually around the bottom of your screen. There's a little menu bar that'll pop up and you can mute yourself. So I would like most people to do that, or all people to do that, so we can minimize background noise for everybody. There's also a little chat box and you can chat me or Tom or anybody with questions if someone's talking and you don't want to interrupt them. I'll be paying attention to the chat box. There's also, a list of people if you want to see who's participating, everybody. But other than that, it's pretty simple.
Okay, let me try. Screen. Okay, I'll try it again. Let's see. Well, that's desktop mode, pro account.
Hey Tom, uncheck use presenter view at the top of that ribbon.
Use presenter view.
Yeah, it's over on the right-hand side.
Of Zoom?
It's in the gray portion. It says monitor automatic, and then under that it says use presenter view. So uncheck the box.
Monitor. This is in PowerPoint or Zoom?
PowerPoint.
Oh, okay. And where was that again?
It's in the gray portion of the ribbon.
Yes.
It says monitors.
Yes.
And it says use presenter view. That checkbox below it. Uncheck that. Nope, just uncheck the box.
Okay. How's that?
There you go.
That works?
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you. Molly solves most of the technical difficulties. So here's the agenda for today, and obviously we need to move through pretty quickly. Almost everything that we're going to talk about is on the website quailcount.org, the NBCI technical website. So that's always a reference, and then we will have the Zoom available later for viewing for those that want a refresher or for people who couldn't attend this. But just about everything we cover is actually on the website. We've already covered the introductions, and we're thrilled that there's so many that are able to attend today. We often, Molly and I will engage individual states or partners who have questions about implementing a coordinated implementation program project. And so that's always the follow-up, is those kinds of one-on-one conversations. So today we're just going to hit the highlights and get people started and try to answer some questions at the end. If at any time something isn't clear, go ahead and stop us, or you can use the little chat feature in Zoom. But for clarification's sake, you can always stop us in mid-sentence. But at the end, we should have time for questions. What we'll cover for about 25 minutes are some of the CIP concepts, and some of this is basic background information. Where did CIP come from? But then we'll get into the details that are more pertinent to if you've already thought through all that and you're ready to get going and you just want to have some questions answered. So we'll go through CIP. Then Molly will talk about some more specifics on sampling and design requirements, and then we'll end with kind of the next steps and time for questions. First, I wanted to acknowledge that NBCI is funded by a wide variety of agencies or supported in some way. Our major funding comes through the Pittman-Robertson funds, or Sport, Fish, and Wildlife Restoration, which means we have very strong input and support by state agencies. This webinar is not about habitat management. Fortunately, that is covered in many other ways. For example, Steve Chapman, one of our NBCI staff, recently had a forest management for northern bobwhite quail webinar that's down there on the lower right-hand side. There is a substantial document in Bring Back Bobwhites called the Comprehensive Guide to Creating, Improving, and Maintaining Bobwhite Habitat. And then, of course, we rely on various partners who are quail experts. So there are a lot of ways you can learn about habitat management. And actually, the very first thing in that list, implicit in the CIP habitat model, is habitat management, but we don't actually provide those kinds of prescriptions or guidance. So why are we here? Well, it's because for decades in some parts of the country, and in the last decade more recently, particularly as NBCI really got going about 2009 or 2010 with the drought in the Great Plains and so forth, everybody was asking, can anything save the bobwhite? And this wasn't about population viability at all, although it is in some cases. If you look down there in the subtitle, it's can this treasured game bird ever be returned to glory? So this is really about huntable populations of quail. That word's not in the dictionary, but it means having enough quail to keep a bird dog interested in quail. And quail hunting and bird dogs really go together. So we're here to restore bobwhite populations ultimately to huntable levels. And of course, we advocate doing that via habitat. Monitoring itself is a pretty quick thing to turn to because accountability is really the model for most businesses these days, and for grants. And for example, with the Conservation Reserve Program, people, especially politicians, are always asking, is it really meeting its objectives? So one of my favorite sayings is, what gets measured gets done. And I think that's absolutely part of the quail culture. And in fact, in many wildlife agencies, there are plenty of doubts about, can you effectively produce quail populations that meet desired levels? So measurement is a key part of that equation. In the 2015 State of the Bobwhite Report, in a science report on the Coordinated Implementation Program, I quoted a participant who was at the Kentucky Department of Wildlife Habitat Management workshop that took place in Shaker Village, Kentucky. And it's a pretty good quote. And of course, anybody who's interested in CIP and been involved in it a long time loves that it identifies all the characteristics of this very complex program. Number one, it's an excellent and absolutely necessary process. And this person was talking about learning to do this very complex habitat assessment. We have to do this to measure whether or not we are doing it is working or not. And this is obviously a massive challenge to get all these different states on board. let alone operating under the same methods consistently. I love this approach. So very positive affirmation of the fact that we have taken this on as a collective group of 25 state agencies and partners. And it's become popular enough that in 2018, we expect to have 25 CIP projects on the ground. The different colors show the different stages of development. The good news is if you're just thinking about it, getting a CIP going now or next year, there's a wide variety of progress going on. And the first ones actually started 2013 or 14, depending on whether or not we count our pilot year. And so their results will be in about 2024, 23 or 24. But CIP itself lives on much longer than that. So the time to join CIP is anytime, really. Why do CIP? What is the value to an agency or organization thinking about having a CIP project? That helps you successfully improve bobwhite populations, the basic thing. That's kind of a given, but as I said, monitoring is such an important part of actually showing that it is possible. Promote the focus on areas large enough to support sustainable bobwhite populations, but small enough for a chance at success in less than 10 years. And that's a chance of measured success. A 50,000 acre CIP area would be fantastic, but the chances of doing effective monitoring at that scale are pretty slim. So we've tended up to have smaller CIPs just because they're doable. CIP provides guidance on how to develop and implement a restoration plan, provides evidence and learning, provides messaging to the public on success, and this is through bringbackbobwhites.org and the outreach and communication section of the NBCI and the NBTC outreach committee, and it provides a solid foundation. A lot of work went into generating the CIP program. Here are a few select background concepts to reiterate and point out some of the details. The foundation of both NBTC and NBCI 2.0, our conservation plan, involved many biologists. Over 600 actually contributed to NBCI 2.0 data. So everything has been a team effort. It's been very science-based with the involvement of university researchers. NBCI coordinates it, but it's implemented by states and partners, and the whole thing is guided by the NBTC. This is just to show some of the kinds of things that have gone on in the development of CIP. Many meetings have taken place, and again, this partnership with NBTC and NBCI. The pilot states shown over there on the right and the people who headed those up really led the charge in defining what is doable in a management and monitoring program that could be implemented by every state agency. The history looks a little bit like this. This is just a small slice of some of the highlights. Going back to the CP33 monitoring program led by Mississippi State University and a partner with what was then called the Northern Bobwhite Conservation Initiative. It's now the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative. We've long tried to demonstrate what can be done with and produced evidence of quail response. However, we kind of stubbed our toes in 2009 when NBTC tried to develop some success definitions that could be adopted across the 25 states, and there really was a lukewarm interest and wasn't very popular. However, in 2011, we launched the NBCI 2.0, which was an update of the first quail plan published in 2002. It's a spatially explicit plan, and concluded that we could produce 4.7 million new coveys if all the habitat management prescribed was implemented. That didn't get off the ground all that well as far as implementation goes, so the next step was the CIP. And as you see on the screen there, in 2014, the foundation is still that spatial database of NBCI 2.0. The next big step, which was called for in CIP, was develop of data management which is the position that Molly holds and is at the University of Tennessee. And finally, just in the past few weeks, we've begun the process of data analysis. So these are just a small slice of some of the key events in CIP and its foundation. A little bit about the spatially explicit goals and achievement, and really some of the implications of that. NBCI 2.0 and CIP adopt the idea that even though we have decades and decades of habitat management and we know we can produce quail, seemingly we're always trying to prove it over and over again. So, and in a lot of cases, there are doubts, and we haven't been all that successful. So the population goals of NBCI 2.0 are stated as hypotheses. And they look like this. Then these are potential coveys added to an existing quail population if all the high priority acres managed as prescribed in NBCI 2.0 are implemented. On the left axis, our state agencies are kind of crowded together there, a number of coveys added. But those, the 4.9 million coveys boils down to something like this when you look at it at a state level. Because the CIP and NBCI 2.0 are spatially based, we can take this down to the focal area level. And just as an example, and this is part of the quailcount.org website, you can come up with a quail population goal for whatever geography we're interested in. 2 weeks ago, we met near Chillicothe, Missouri, and you see the red star there. So we're going to draw a little square around the focal area called 2C, that's Missouri Department of Conservation focal area, and look at some of the numbers for that area. So this is, again, something that you can do using tools on quailcount.org. So this is just going down deeper into that area and surrounding what appears to be about a 6,000 acre area. I double clicked on it to come up with an estimate. It provides various prescriptions for habitat, land use opportunities, land use or obstacles to carrying out quail conservation. Again, this is still all in the areas where Missouri Department of Conservation biologists identified this as having high prospects for quail potential. The green shows less prospect, and I guess it's kind of orangish gold color is lower prospects. And in that little square, which turns out to be, if you look in the lower left-hand corner, 6,218 acres, the number of potential bobwhites added to that landscape is 418. So those are the kinds of things that form the basis for population goals for a SIP that you might develop. It will be a spatially explicit population estimate. And we are in the process of revising those estimates for now, but for now, what we have in NBCI 2.0 are still our goals. And indeed, this area, 2C in Missouri, is an outstanding example of what CIP reflects. The control there is actually what we call the reference area, and the blue is the 2C focal area. And the reason for control or reference area is to show that difference between the landscape without habitat management and then the result in quail population response when you add habitat. An absolutely outstanding example of what's possible. As good as that is, when we first launched CIP, we were criticized because in general, it's a pretty small scale operation. 2C focal area is about 6,000 acres. I think the largest CIP in Texas is 20-some thousand acres. And that's not going to get us to 4.9 million coveys very quickly. But again, the key is, and this is where the biologist ranking information or BRI comes in, around 2C focal area is huge potential. And that gets to this whole point of the purpose of CIP is it is a key step in showing what can be demonstrated But really, the overall long-range goal is to have huntable populations far beyond those SIP boundaries. So it's just the first step in trying to make quail restoration and decent quail populations just a byproduct of management, regular agricultural management. Of course, there are other measures of success, whether or not you achieved habitat objectives specified in SIP. Just having a minimum viable population in some cases will be a measure of success. Demonstration, best management practices, and of course, environmental benefits that result from the habitat that has been put on the ground, whether it's in songbird populations, water quality, etc. So success can be measured in many ways, but the bottom line long-term measure is huntable populations of quail. Okay, quickly shifting over to the next part of the agenda, habitat goals. Again, quailcount.org is the go-to place for SIP information. Just about everything said on the webinar today can be found there. The key tab to go to look at SIP issues is the monitoring tab. We just couldn't fit coordinated implementation program in a tab, so we used the word monitoring. That really represents SIP. And here's just a little guide again to what's on there. The one thing that is relatively new, shown there in the bottom in orange, is habitat management. We'll talk a little bit about that. But most of the SIP resources right now, the keys to implementing a SIP today, are the spring breeding bird monitoring, the fall covey monitoring, and the habitat monitoring. This is a schematic, and it's from one of the narrated slideshows in the training section of the website. And this is really probably one of the most important slides and images for you to consider if you're going to implement a SIP. So let's unpack this really quickly. Number one, it's a 10-year program. We expect and hope that by the 5th year, quail habitat acreage goals have been reached. The reason for that is that gives a quail population ample time, another 5 years, to respond to that full complement of habitat. Every year, habitat monitoring surveys are conducted, as are breeding bird surveys and fall covey counts, and habitat management surveys. Actually, I mistakenly said the habitat surveys are every year. They're only at year 1, 5, and 10. So the top part there shows years 1, 5, and 10 for habitat monitoring. Gathering up all the SIP essentials. So this is kind of this list of things for a SIP coordinator to think about. The goal is at least 1,500 acres of habitat that comprises 25% of the focal area, a fall quail density based on those NBCI 2-point definitions and ongoing revision, all of which should be 50% of that goal should be reached in 5 years and completely reached by 10 years. And in many cases, it's going to happen much sooner than that. The experimental design includes the addition of a reference area to compare the focal area to and sample points for measuring quail and grassland birds, measuring habitat, what we call habitat monitoring, the annual quantification of the actual management. This is for later developing BMPs, prescriptions for the future, and identifying just what programs actually contributed to the habitat monitoring measurements in the previous step. And then other desirable management and monitoring include weather. Of course, that's something that NBCI in the analysis stage can gather. Harvest, most desirably, is at least measured and managed, certain prescriptions. Pen-raised quail, either release is prevented and or if quail are released, it's measured. But really for a SIP, we don't want pen-raised quail, partly because it just confuses quail abundance measurements. Data management is the other essential part that, even though it's an NBCI project, it was built with a lot of work from NBTC staff. And in reality, we rely on every SIP coordinator to keep entering their data and keep things up to date. Analysis, we'll talk about a little bit later, the next essential step in this process. And we're entering our 4th or 5th year of SIP, and analysis is just now starting. Reporting tools for SIP coordinators, it's not just a matter of providing the analysis, it's having tools on quailcount.org that easily enable you to add something to a report or a presentation. And of course, the ultimate goal is success, so that you can either grow the size of that SIP or repeat it somewhere else. And if it's not successful in reaching quail population goals, learn and adapt. So that's kind of that whole adaptive management paradigm, that success really is reaching quail goals. And if you don't reach the quail goals, know why. Okay, taking a quick look at the quailcount.org website, most of the resources for designing and thinking about a SIP can be found in this monitoring tab. And if you scroll down in there, probably the best place to go to start understanding SIP is the Habitat Training Manual and a series of 5 presentations, narrated PowerPoints, developed for NBCI by Ken Dern when he worked for us a couple of years ago. It was really a chance to take a look at many resources on the quailcount.org and put it in one place. So this is a key place to start. And in the introduction to SIP, Ken covers basic design issues. And one thing that I need to try to do is figure out how many places we state that a SIP needs at least 1,500 acres of habitat. That is 25% in the area. It's probably in 8 or 9 different places, but Ken provides one of the best illustrations of that in his narrated PowerPoint. So I encourage you to visit those PowerPoints. The habitat itself in the habitat training manual is excellent, provides good guidance on how to accomplish something that's relatively new. Most have a fair amount of experience with spring breeding bird surveys and fall covey counts. It's the habitat assessment that is new, and so we spend a lot more time explaining that on quailcount.org. And there's a whole series of training webinars on how to do a habitat assessment based on the training put on by John Morgan and staff with the Kentucky Department of Wildlife. Finally, the data entry overview, real quickly. If you look on quailcount.org, there's a little tab there in the center, input. There are other ways to get it through the NBCI inventory or through the monitoring breeding bird and fall quail count tabs, but an input takes you directly there. And the keys to inputting data, this is a bit of a calendar, so if you're thinking about a SIP, you get an idea of what that means over the year. NBCI inventory data, which can be part of a SIP and is inputted by the state quail coordinator, is done February to March of each year, and that's been going on for almost 8 years now, I think. New is all the SIP databases. So the SIP habitat monitoring data entry hasn't been developed and will be launched in June, and will be the deadline each year will be December. That is entered by the SIP coordinator, so that may or may not be the state quail coordinator. SIP breeding bird data entry, which is entered by the SIP coordinator, takes place during June to September, and that's a database that's been open since 2016, so we're going on 2 years of those data entry. And similarly, the quail covey count data entry occurs after those data are collected with a deadline of December 15th each year. So this gives you an idea of the annual markers for getting data entered. The database is at the University of Tennessee. It's a secure database, and so access is only through a secure user ID and password. This also gives you access to the UT library and online journals. Okay, that indicates it's time to transition to Molly's part of the sampling design. So I'll stop sharing.
All right. So we're going to get a little bit more technical now and start talking about more specifics about focal and reference areas and data collection. And so we'll start out with the kind of overall look of what focal and reference areas are like. And obviously you want these areas to be somewhat similar in size and habitat composition to make sure that you can have a valid control for your focal area and detect changes in your focal area. Both areas will receive the same sampling effort. So you should be sampling the same amount of points on your focal area as you would on your reference area. There's a couple things about the reference area that's really important to note. Reference areas need to be kind of a low risk of change by stakeholders or landowners. There shouldn't be a lot of motivation, I guess, to change that area, because if a lot of management changes occur in that area, it could kind of throw off the fact that it's supposed to be a control for your focal area. And so the reference areas are supposed to have mandatory spring counts, and they're very preferred for fall, and I don't think we have any states that are not doing fall counts also on their reference areas. So it's important that you get this data because it makes it a lot easier to do more complete analyses later on. And when you sample your reference areas, you should be doing it within 7 days of your focal area sampling to minimize the temporal variability. You don't want to have totally different weather conditions or something when you do your focal area sampling compared to your reference area sampling, because that can affect how much these birds are calling. So sampling design on your focal area and reference area, it'll cover about 20% of the focal area. So you're going to have enough sampling points to ensure that you're sampling about 20% of the whole entire focal area. So every state has a different amount of sampling points because their focal area might be a different size than another state. And sampling points are randomly selected along roads. However, up to 50% of those you could place off-road. And there's definitely, currently with our states that are participating, there's definitely a varying degree of that. A lot of them are all on roads, and some of them are definitely doing a lot of off-road points. It's really up to you and what makes the most sense for your focal area. So all of our surveys are done annually, and replication for the bird surveys, we usually like to do spring breeding counts twice, and fall counts, I believe most people are trying to do them twice a year. However, we do have the stipulation that if it's a really high density area, you can do it one time a year. So let's talk a little bit about the spring breeding bird surveys. In the CIP manual, which I'll show you guys at the end of this presentation, there's a lot of helpful tables, such as this one, that kind of details what data you'll be collecting and how these surveys are going to work. So if you look at this, you'll see that we usually have approximately a 6-week window to try and get that peak calling rate. And these surveys, you can also include other grassland species. So if your agency or who you work for, your organization, is interested in other grassland bird species and want to get counts of their calls as well, you can do that during these surveys, along with northern bobwhite calls. So they start about a half hour before sunrise and go till about 3 hours after sunrise. But you're only spending about 5 minutes at each point. So you can go for only so much time depending on how many points you want to hit that day. And each point count radius is a 250 meter circle. So each point is a 250 meter circle in the spring that you'll be detecting birds on. And those are probably the most important parts of the spring breeding bird surveys. Obviously, we'll point you to the manual after this, and you can read some more about them if you want to. But this is an example data sheet. So on our website, we actually have downloadable data sheets. They come with a GIS file even, so you can set up your own aerial map photos and make it pretty simple to take these just out in the field after you set the aerial map and use them out in the field. So those are available to you for free. So the fall cubby count surveys are a little more involved. We collect a little bit more data in terms of noise level, whether you're using electronic cubby calls or not, and you should really only use those after you complete one replication without them. But we also are looking a lot for flush quail observations. If you have a fair amount of quail in your area and you can get over 10 coveys to be flushed, you can start counting actual individual birds if it's possible and start figuring out the calculation for quail per acre instead of coveys per acre, which is nice. The point count radius for this, however, is a little bit bigger. So we actually survey a 500-meter circle for the fall cubby counts. And the cubby counts are also a 6 to 8 week window, so a little bit longer, but we like to try and do them before hunting occurs. And they're more time intensive just because you spend 45 minutes at each point, and you can really only do 1 point a day unless you have a lot of field workers out there. Because you start 45 minutes before sunrise and you go until sunrise. So, and I think that so again, this is where you'd want to make sure that you're getting 20% of your focal area being surveyed. So usually for spring counts, you have a lot of states. I mean, it depends again on your focal area size, but a lot of our states probably have around 25 to 30 sampling points in their focal area for spring. And in fall, they usually have around 6 to 10 based on the size of their focal area. So it's not quite as many points, but they're still a little more intensive since you can only really do one a day. This is a sample data sheet for the fall cubby counts. Again, you can download these off our website. It comes with a GIS file where you can start putting in your own aerial maps if you're interested in looking at those. So the most intense habitat or data collection is the habitat monitoring data. We have a lot of little parts to this. So one of the parts is cover mapping. This is where you're going to start outlining distinct habitat patches on these data sheets. So you'll drop your aerial photo in there, and then you can draw, like this example over to the right here. You can draw on that and figure out what patches are, what patches have similar composition to them, similar vegetation structure, and you'll start delineating those. And when you're out in the field, you can verify that those are indeed those patches, and you'll collect all this structural data on them, and we'll look at the data sheet for that in a second. But each patch will have associated with it all sorts of different things about understory cover, so herbaceous cover, whether it's grass dominated, forb dominated, canopy closure, things of that nature, bare ground coverage, and whether it's crop fields or not, etc. So when you're doing your cover mapping, the minimum patch size should be 900 square meters. The protective cover is a little bit different. So this is the second little portion of mapping where you'll create a separate layer. So in ArcGIS, you'll have one layer of patches, and then you'd create a separate layer of protective cover. And this is vegetation that provides year-round overhead protection from predators or weather conditions to those bobwhite quail. So this is very important, and this is kind of what our habitat model really depends on. There being protective cover in your focal area. And so protective cover sizes need to be at least 95 square meters to be mapped. So it's about the size of this little red dot actually in the middle. And so, as I said before, you'll be collecting a lot of structural data on those patches you've delineated. We do prefer that the points are able to be walked instead of estimated from the road. If you don't have public access, then you can certainly estimate them from the road, but there are attributes that are very hard to estimate from the road. So it's much easier if you have full access to the land to be able to walk your survey points, and you'll get a lot more accurate data. But at the end of all this data collection out in the field, you're going to end up going back to ArcGIS and digitizing all of this data. And so all those delineated patches you'll make into polygons, and then you'll enter all that structural data so it's associated with each patch in GIS. So after you're out in the field and you mark it all with pen, you'll start going to ArcGIS and digitizing it like this example. So all that pink stuff is protective cover, and they buffered it out by 50 meters, so that's why you're seeing these big pink blobs. So this is the example. This is actually one of Kentucky's data forms for their cover mapping. So this is where you're going to start drawing and looking at all your patches on the aerial photo and comparing when you're actually out in the field. And this is the structural data that you'll collect. So for each patch, if say you have 10 patches on that survey point that you've delineated, you're going to go through and you're going to go collect all of this data about coverage of grass and forbs, how many forb species are present, bare ground, if there's a good amount of bare ground for little tiny chicks to be able to walk around, etc. So all of this will end up in a GIS system at the end of it. And the last portion of this is the habitat management data collection portion. This is a database that we have not built yet, but it's coming probably by the end of fall or the beginning of fall. We're going to be able to do a lot of GIS collection of this data. So when you do a habitat treatment to your focal area, say that you burn 100 acres or something in your focal area, you'll have tracking of that. So you'll be able to put that in a GIS, digitize it, and be able to send that to our databases, and we'll keep everything there. So when we start doing these analyses, we can see, what practices are very important to bobwhite quail, what might have precipitated a habitat response, a bobwhite response to habitat management. And so this type of data, we're hoping to collect it annually. And we're hoping to manage about 21 different management practices or track those. And these are all listed in the Habitat Manual. There's a couple of them listed here, but there's 21 of them in quail count. So we will go quail count. And so I'm just going to give you guys a little overview of our website and where we were talking about, or at least where Tom was talking about for a lot of these things. So in the monitoring tab, if you go to overview, most of the things that we've said here during this webinar, you can actually read all about in this coordinated implementation program manual. If you click in there, you'll see all sorts of details and technical information about habitat data collection, spring breeding bird count data collection, fall covey counts, etc. That is all there for you. And we have some other more general CIP or CIP program type of information. You can see down here states that are currently participating, other ones that are in development, some that are really ahead of the game, like Iowa, for instance. They've got 2 official CIPs already. If you go to spring breeding bird, you'll be able to go down and you can download our data sheets here. This is where you could go to enter data if you're part of our CIP program. Fall covey counts is very similar. You can go download our data sheets. You can look at that table that I showed earlier from the PowerPoint. You can download electronic audio files for your electronic callers if you need it. There's a lot of useful little information on here. And we're hoping that we'll add a covey count manual, so much like the habitat monitoring manual. We're hoping to have a covey count manual pretty soon for training purposes. So the habitat monitoring tab, also again, you can get your data sheets. But this is where that training is about habitat monitoring, because it is so in-depth and involved. You can come down here and download this manual, or you can watch those special PowerPoint presentations or watch any of these videos to learn more about how we do our habitat monitoring. So the inventory is a non-spatial database currently that we have that collects a lot of information on management throughout participating states. So management treatments. Right now, unless you're part of our program, there's not much that you can do on this page, but you're more than welcome to read it. We also have, not that one. We also have a resources tab where we have a calendar, which we update with dates such as today, where we update dates where we have databases opening for data entry, closing dates where your data is due by this date, and other important information. You also have a link to UT libraries. If you have a net ID and log in, you can get in there. And our e-journal, so National Quail Symposium Proceedings, which contains tons and tons, over 500 publications, all about bobwhite quail. So that's kind of an overview of our website. I think that's it for what I wanted to cover. So it is all you, Tom.
Okay. Thanks, Molly.
Mm-hmm.
Just a note on the inventory while I try to share my page properly. Okay. The inventory has been used to report CIP focal area habitat management. So, for example, in the current State of the Bobwhite report, which is where the habitat inventory is published, Tennessee reported potential focal areas, and now we're working with Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency to actually implement a CIP. And so a good first step is to, if you're not a state staffer, to work with the state quail coordinator to get your habitat management into the inventory. And I cover that in a second. Well, okay, can you see my screen? Does it show the map?
Yep.
Molly, okay. Excellent. So again, we anticipate 25 projects on board this year, and many of you are many of the states listed there on this call. I tried to go down through the list. So, for example, Stan from Illinois, will be working with him on site selection. We've been working with the Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency on site selection. And the process there is typically a Zoom between a couple of the agency or organization staff and Molly and I. So that's one of the next big first steps. And again, there's just a tremendous opportunity for somebody to start a CIP right now or in the next few years, because it is a work in progress. And most notably, the thing that's changed just in the past year is the opportunity to do data analysis. It was something that it was on paper, something we were going to do, but we happened to come up with funding from FSA because they wanted to know how is CRP benefiting quail. And we said, well, we have a program for evaluating that sort of thing, and convince them to fund the analysis that is going to be the prototype for analysis that would take place on CIPs that do not have private land and CRP. So right now, and you see in the lower left-hand corner, most of this work is contracted to Dr. James Martin with the University of Georgia, and we held a meeting 2 weeks ago to start the plans for that. So you see some of the CIP coordinators involved in that project. So stay tuned for that information, because it really is going to be the prototype for all CIP analysis and reporting the results. So just to go through a checklist, and we're doing well on time, a little bit ahead of schedule. So I have this that I'll show as just kind of this mental checklist, that things that are important to prepare for doing the CIP. If you're not with the state agency, it's very important that you work with the state quail coordinator. in your state. You probably know those, but if not, they're listed in the bringbackbobwhites.org website of NBCI's. And again, this is just to reiterate that if it might be a couple of years before you actually can begin the monitoring, provide the shape files and so forth for a SIP, I encourage you to report your habitat management to your state quail coordinator so it can be in the NBCI inventory. Talk to other SIP coordinators. Those folks have experience, especially those pilot states. They've been doing this for almost 5 years now, and can share all the obstacles and positives for carrying this out. We do have hard copies now of the actual SIP version 1.1, which was published in 2016 and just printed this past summer. You might have picked one up at the NBTC annual meeting in Knoxville past summer. If not, they'll always be available at NBTC meetings to be run out, or send me an email and I make sure you get a copy. And we also have hard copies now of the habitat manual. So, so it's not just resources on quailcount.org, there are some hard copies. Work with Molly and I at any step. Send us an email, give us a phone call. The preparation for doing a SIP involves really months of site selection, and in some case well over a year. So right now, if you hope to start collecting data this summer that was going to be entered in the NBCI database, you should be contacting Molly and I in the next few weeks, and at the latest by the end of March. The first step for being able to enter data, other than the secure data access and getting a user ID, is to provide the shape files for your focal and reference area and all the points. And your SIP is deemed official once you actually start entering the breeding bird or fall covey data. Keep up with all the developments via the NBTC listserv. You can contact that website to get on that listserv. It's always very important, if at all possible, to go to the annual meeting. This year it's August 6th to 9th in Albany, Georgia. And check out the resources tab on the quailcount.org website. So we'll transition to that ending slide. I love this approach. There's no doubt that it is daunting, and the states that are participating now that are starting their second iteration of habitat evaluation have gone a long ways and reaching these SIP goals for putting quail on the ground. But it's definitely a daunting approach. I think that's the last slide I have. Let's see. Yep. So let me stop share this so we can see people.
If you guys have questions, most of you are muted. So if to talk to us, you'll need to unmute yourselves before you can say anything. But now is the time for questions.
We've either confused everybody, or you're anxious to get off this webinar and go to quailcount.org and watch Ken Duran or John Morgan in action.
Hey, Tom.
Yes.
Todd is asking that we decide that cover mapping was no longer necessary we decided that at the Missouri meeting. Todd?
Yeah, well, there's always been, I assume you can hear me, there's always been
Yep.
3 levels that we said we would map. We said we'd map the entire focal area, cover map it. That's in the CIP, so that's like a 50,000 foot level looking at an aerial photo. We're gonna do the habitat monitoring around the points. We're also gonna do the habitat management practices that are occurring on the ground. But I thought at Chillicothe 2 weeks ago, we made the decision that James would probably just do the cover mapping with national land cover data. That way it'd be uniform with all the states. Or did I not understand that correctly?
We're working on the summary of that meeting now, and we plan to send it out by the end of the week. And so that's when we'll answer that question, Todd. So I know there was some confusion about that, so we'll clarify that at that point.
Okay, thanks.
One question asked in the chat was about the secure access, and just to give you an idea of how this has worked, every state quail coordinator, so there are 25, have entered data in the NBCI inventory for 7 or 8 years now. So they've always been in the database. Once we added CIP, added the alternative of having that person enter data or somebody that might be the CIP coordinator. So in some cases, we have 2 people entering data in the database. And a lot of the data is at a certain level is visible to all, but much of it is not. And in fact, one of the agenda items for the NBTC Science Subcommittee during the next 6 months is decide on data ownership with the Coordinated Implementation Program. So there are all kinds of complexities that go along with a national database that we're dealing with. Another question, there must be one. Okay, here's a chat on how many SIPs do we expect overall. The goal in the beginning was at least 1 per state. With 25 NBTC states, that's 25. But what we're finding now is multiple SIPs per state. So for example, Iowa's had 2 SIP projects for several years now. Missouri is adding a second one this year. Georgia has had 2 for a number of years. So we're getting more than 1 now per state. And we have some states that do not yet have a SIP. So it looks like we might reach that rate of 25 this year, but that certainly is, I think that's just the beginning. Other questions? Final call for questions. Okay, I think that's it. Well, again, thank you for participating in this webinar. This is the first for Molly and I encourage you, if you're interested in doing a SIP or want further clarification, to follow up with an email or phone call to us. And we typically, on these one-on-one smaller calls, can look at all kinds of specific questions relevant to sites you might be considering. So with that, we'll adjourn the webinar. And again, thank you on the behalf of NBCI and NBTC for your interest in SIP.